Friends, in the series which we are doing on the making of contemporary India from 1950 to 1990s, today we will talk about the second part which we did on emergency. And as we talked in the first part, that how emergency unfolded in India, what were the reasons for the imposition of emergency at that point of time, the way it was being justified by Mrs. Indira Gandhi, and the critics they have argued that how emergency could not have been justified in any sense, and the longevity of emergency that it lasted for nearly 19 months should have been totally avoided, and how it changed the Indian political scenario for times to come. And such an event with in the context of the imposition of the internal emergency was seen to be a momentous event in the history of the Indian politics. And in the context of the readings, you can see Bipin Chandra, India after independence, Ramchandra Guha, India after Gandhi, Inder Malhotra, Indira Gandhi, Tariq Ali, Nehru's and Gandhi's and Indian dynasty. So these are some of the readings which one can refer when one is talking about emergency. And Bipin Chandra, he has argued that the people did not see emergency as a substitute for democracy or as an attempt to impose a dictatorship, and even when the emergency was imposed, then Indira Gandhi asserted that she was fully committed to the multi-party democracy and a free press, and that emergency was an abnormal remedy for an abnormal situation, and that democratic conditions would be restored and elections held as soon as situation returned to normal. But we see that these kinds of claims, they were being made, but in the long run the emergency continued for nearly 19 months, and people, they also got disillusioned after initial few months. And we also find that how agricultural output, it declined during this time, and prices, they increased by the end of 1976. And the corrupt black marketeers and the smugglers, they also resumed their activities as shock of the emergency wore off over a period of time. And we find that how poor people, they got disenchanted with the slow progress in their welfare, and workers, they were also not very happy because of the limits on the wages, bonus and dearness allowance, and restrictions on the right to strike. And many of the government servants and the teachers, they also were feeling discontented because they were being disciplined in their workplace, and in many cases they were being forced to fulfill sterilization quotas which were there. So all these kinds of things which were happening in the context of the emergency, many of the people, they were not very happy with the governments, the way they were being disciplined, or how they were being forced to take part in the sterilization program of the government. And many times we find that they were being given targets, they were being forced to complete those targets, and which put them under a lot of stress. And in the long run also it created that kind of a situation in the 70s, that the people became fearful of those kinds of measures which were undertaken by the government. And we find that at this point of time, when emergency was being imposed, not much real progress could be made, and could be made the way it was being proclaimed earlier. And new agencies of social change or organs for popular mobilizations, they were also not being created. And we also find that the reliance for the implementation of 20-point program and other development programs was placed exclusively on the same old corrupt and inefficient bureaucracy and the manipulative and discredited politicians. So new agencies with a clean track record, they did not come at this point of time, and the earlier mechanisms which were there, they continued, and they were not seen to be effective, and how they were being criticized, how they were seen to be corrupt. And we find that when we try to understand the situation from the perspective of the common people, that how they saw this particular situation, And in that context, we find that for them matters took a turn for the worse, because there were no avenues of protest or any kind of other mechanism for voicing and redressal of their grievances. And even common people, and not merely intellectuals and political workers, they lived in an atmosphere of fear and insecurity. So when we talk about the common people, we also see that others, those who were the political workers, intellectuals, etc., they were also in the this kind of a fear of fear of insecurity. So they were not very happy with the way the situation had unfolded, and they wanted that the situation should change with the removal or of emergency. And we find that when you tend to understand emergency, the organs of the government, whether the bureaucracy or the police, they got increased power, and that was unchecked by the criticism and exposure from the press, because press has also been muzzled. The way the courts, etc., the restrictions, they were being also placed on them, and the MLAs and MPs and the other political parties and the popular movements, they were not also allowed to function. And so in that sense, we find that bureaucracy and police, both of them, they were abusing their power in the usual forms, and the drastic press censorship and the silencing of the protest, it led to the government being kept in complete ignorance of what was happening in the country. So there was some kind of a chaos in that context, that people, they were not being aware that what will happen at the next stage. And they also realized and believed that what was appearing in the press or on the radio, it was heavily censored, and they no longer trusted the kind of news which was fed to them through the government machinery. And many of them, they relied much on the rumors, and they believed the worst regarding the action of the government or the intention of the government. So this kind of a miscommunication in that sense was also responsible for creating that kind of a situation where government was not believed by the masses. As you can see on the screen as well, that how the transformation or the kind of changes were also happening in the context of the denial of the civil liberties, which began to be felt by the common people as it began to impact their daily lives in the form of harassment and corruption by the petty officials. And the delay in lifting the emergency began to generate fear that authoritarian character or the structure of the rule might be made permanent or continue for a long time. Particularly as Mrs. Gandhi had got Parliament to postpone elections by 1 year in November 1976. So we find that there was a fear that this kind of an authoritarian rule may continue for a long period of time. And when Parliament postponed elections in November 1976 for a year, then there was a possibility that they may take place in sometime in November 1977. And we find that though elections took place in March 1976, and it was some kind of a shock when elections, they were being announced. So we will discuss that why these kind of sudden elections, they were being announced at that point of time. What were the reasons for the sudden announcement of the elections, even when the Parliament had postponed them for 1 year in November 1976 till so we find that the kind of the way situation was unfolding in India, how the intelligentsia in the framework of the teachers, journalists, professional, small town lawyers and the middle class, how they viewed the 42nd Amendment to the Constitution, which was passed in September 1976 as an effort to subvert the democracy by changing the very basic structure of the Constitution. And we find that emergency, which might have been acceptable to some of the masses, initially it began to lose its legitimacy. So the legitimacy which was attached with the emergency, because it came through one of the articles of the Constitution, and in that context, Article 352 of the Constitution, and the way people, they were not seeing it as a legitimate thing now, because of the way emergency proceeded during this time, the way it functioned during this period. And we also find that emergency regime also became unpopular, that how other leaders, those who were not directly connected with the Congress or with the government as well, Sanjay Gandhi for example, the way he was functioning as in extra constitutional center of power, and the way he was not holding any kind of office in the government or in the Congress, and despite that he was the one who was instrumental in making a lot of decisions and getting things done. And the way he also emerged as a parallel authority, the way he was interfering in the working of the government and the administration. And by April 1976, it became quite evident that the way he was in a way interfering in the functioning of the government. And we also find that he was obeyed by the senior ministers and the Congress leaders and various chief ministers and the civil servants, and he had become some sort of a center of power. And he, within Congress, when we tend to understand his position, he had emerged as the leader of the Youth Congress, which rivaled parent party in political weight. So when we tend to analyze the situation, that how Sanjay Gandhi as a person became more dominant in the functioning of the government, which was not liked by others, those who wanted some kind of a democratic functioning within the party as well as the government. And we find that in July 1976, Sanjay Gandhi put forward his 4 points, which gradually became more important than the official 20 points, the 20-point program which we have already discussed. And these 4 points were: don't take dowry at time of marriage, practice family planning and limit families to only 2 children, plant trees, and promote literacy. So these were the 4 points which were given by Sanjay Gandhi, and we find that over a period of time how these 4 points they became the most important points, and how the 20 points which were given by the government, they lost their sheen. And in these 4 points we find that how family planning and the way the issue of family planning was being imposed on the Indian population, and it brought a lot of discredit to the government of those times. And a number of films etc., they were also being made on the draconian nature of emergency. And we also find that how some kind of a determination was there in Sanjay Gandhi to beautify the cities by clearing the slums and the unauthorized structures which are impeding the roads, bazaars, parks, monuments, etc. So for that we find that how people, they got displaced from the region in which they were living for beautification purposes, and they were being resettled in other areas. So resettlement of the people from their own original place to other areas became a matter of concern, and many of them, they were not happy with the way the government was functioning. And we find that when the government used such kind of policies with regard to the resettlement of the people, the way they were being forcibly sent from their own areas to other areas, in the similar manner in the context of the family planning as well, that how vigorously it was being followed, and many times it was to be arbitrary, illegitimate and authoritarian in character, so which was not liked by many people, and how Indira Gandhi was routed out of her own from the government or from the position of power when such kind of policies, they were being imposed during emergency. And we find that initially a lot of incentives and persuasion, they were being used to in a way convince the people about the importance of the family planning, but over a period of time they got replaced by the ideals of compulsion and coercion, and by compulsory sterilization. So it became some sort of a burden on the masses. And how so many government servants, school teachers, etc., health workers, they were given fixed quotas of number of persons they had to motivate to undergo sterilization. So they were also under a lot of pressure, and police and administration added their might to enforcement of quotas. And we find that when they were not able to convince the masses, then they used other kind of tactics which were in the framework of forcible or using force in front of the masses, so that they go for sterilization process. And we find that in these kinds of excesses which were being committed, the people from the rural and the urban poor, they got affected, and many a times they took recourse to flight, hiding and rioting, because they did not have much choice. Either they had to hide to avoid sterilization, or they had to fight, or they had to run away. So all sorts of methods they were being employed by the people to in a way avoid that kind of a situation. And we also find that during this time, because of the press censorship, the stories, true and false, whatever kinds of stories of forcible vasectomies and violent resistance by people, they spread quickly during this time. And the slum clearance and the demolition of the unauthorized structures, they also followed a pattern of the family planning program, but were enforced with even greater callousness and cruelty, though they affected mainly Delhi and few other cities. So we find that the way the ideas of family planning, the way slum clearance and demolition of unauthorized structure, it was being carried out, the way people they got resettled in other areas, that was also being done. So they were following that kind of a pattern where a lot of force that was being used, and many times we consider it to be a lot of cruel in nature, and because of which it created some kind of a bad blood among the people, those who got in a way those who got affected. And at the directions of Sanjay Gandhi, when such kind of measures they were being taken, they were not liked by the masses. And we find that how Indira Gandhi announced the elections on 18 January 1977, and they were considered to be surprise elections. As I told you that in November 1976, the elections they got postponed for a year in the parliament. And this kind of a declarations that elections would be held in March 1977 was some kind of a news to masses, because they felt that when parliament had passed that elections would be postponed for a year, so they may not happen in the near future. So these were in a way the surprise elections, and how the political prisoners they were being released, and the press censorship was also removed, and other restrictions on the political activity such as holding of the public meetings, etc., they were also removed at this point of time. And we find that how political parties they were being allowed to campaign freely, and elections they were held on 16th March in a free and fair atmosphere. And then Congress was defeated in the elections, and how Indira Gandhi and Sanjay Gandhi lost their seats. And Mrs. Gandhi, she issued a statement in which she accepted the verdict of the people with due humility. And we find that after that emergency also ended on 21st March 1977. So nearly after 19 months and the emergency ended, and in the As I communicated to you, that how the surprise elections, they played an important role in terms of the routing of the Congress party, and how even both the leaders, those who were seen to be authoritarian in nature, Mrs. Gandhi and Sanjay Gandhi, both of them, they lost their seats as well. So there are certain questions that how Mrs. Gandhi announced and then hold open and free elections. Why did she, in a way, took that kind of a decision that the elections, they were being held, and when she had already got the parliament to postpone the elections by 1 year. And so we do not have any satisfactory kind of an answer to that, and only some kind of speculations with regard to that, why she went for early elections despite the fact that they got postponed for a year. So the people, those who are in support of Mrs. Gandhi, they convey that there was some kind of an underlying commitment of Mrs. Gandhi to the liberal democracy and the democratic values. And when she became aware of the emergency excesses and realized that matters were getting out of her control, she decided to get out of this trap by holding the elections, even if it meant losing the power. So the people, those who are in a way trying to support Indira Gandhi, they argue that she was in a way committed to the ideals of liberal democracy and the democratic values. And on the other hand, the people, those who are critics, they argue that she was not able to read the popular temper, and how she was in a way misinformed by the sycophants and the intelligence agencies, and she was convinced that she would win. But in a way, when we tend to understand the position of Indira Gandhi, then she was isolated from the public opinion, and she was not aware of the extent to which her rule had become unpopular among the masses. By winning the elections, she hoped to vindicate emergency and also clear way for Sanjay Gandhi to succeed her. So this is the kind of view which has been given by the people, those who are critics of Indira Gandhi, that how she was not able to understand the situation which was prevailing in those times, and she was not in any way in touch with the masses. Then there is third argument, which says that she realized that the policies of emergency had to be legitimized further through elections, and the imposition of emergency had been legitimized at outset by constitutional provision, but that was not enough in view of deep-seated traditions of Indian people. So the third view is with regard to this idea, that she also realized during the due course of time that the policies which were being followed during the times of emergency, they had to be legitimized through the elections, and unless she will have elections, then she could not legitimize those policies in the long run. And she also felt that how emergency had been legitimized because at the initial point only, because it was through the constitutional provision. And so these were some of the things they were being talked about. And she also realized that emergency was getting a lot of discredit during this time, and they had to in a way bring that kind of an approach. At that point of time, they have to take certain measures by which this kind of discrediting can be rolled back. And we find that the way emergency was being imposed, the way the authoritarian content of the emergency was there, the way the brutality was there in terms of suppressing the dissent. So these were some of the concerns which were important concerns of those times. And there was some kind of a need in terms of for the political authority to go back to the democratic system and to seek the mandate of the people. And it was also realized that this kind of a muzzling of the democratic voices would not happen in India, as if you see the size and the diversity of India and the democratic traditions which were there. So from that point of view, that kind of repression should not take place. And there were others, those who were the critics of democracy, and they felt that the democratic system would not function very well in India in future, and they did not have much hope in terms of survival of this political crisis. And they also argued that how India had finally joined the ranks of other post-colonial societies as an authoritarian state. The way authoritarianism had creeped into the other post-colonial societies, similarly this kind of authoritarianism has also come into the Indian society as well. And we find that some kind of changes which were being initiated by the emergency, they were to be continued in some way, and when the emergency would end, then the parliamentary system can be restored, and those changes which are considered to be legitimate in nature, they can be kept. And there were others, those who argued that this kind of authoritarianism, it was there since 1950s, and it was inherent in a poor and illiterate society. So it was there from the earlier times. And there were others, those who felt that it was not possible to combine the economic development with democracy, that they had to either choose one, whether they had to choose democracy or they had to choose economic development. It was very difficult to combine both of them. And there were others, those who argued that liberal democracy was only a facade. It was hiding the underlying brutal reality of class domination and suppression of people's struggles. Emergency had therefore only removed that facade. It did not mean any basic political change, except that social and political reality was now visible to all. And there were others, those who were convinced that emergency was a temporary departure from the basic commitment of Indian people and its political leadership to democracy, and that democracy would be sooner or later restored in the country. And we find that how the democratic system in India not only survived the JP movement and emergency, but also became stronger in the later times. And since 1977, all talk about the dictatorship to develop economically and to end corruption has also died down. We also see that how when emergency got lifted, free elections, they were being held. It was a defining moment in the India's post-independence history, and how the commitment of the people, attachment of the people to the democratic values and the institutions could be seen during this time, and how it was also the result of the impact of the freedom struggle and the experience of the democratic functioning, including the free elections since 1947. We also find that in the elections of March 1977, the urban and the rural poor, they demonstrated in a very concrete and striking fashion that the questions of basic civil rights were not merely preoccupations of urban middle classes, as has been argued by Tariq Ali. We also see that how the covering of the election campaign, how Inder Malhotra, he reported of the truly remarkable manner in which the village audience in the remote countryside, they reacted to the sophisticated arguments about the civil liberties, fundamental rights and the independence of the judiciary. So whatever the character of the JP movement or the emergency regime, there is no doubt that the way elections they were held in India, they restored the faith of the people in the democracy, and the years of 75 to 77, they were seen to be the test of democracy, and Indian people, they passed this test with distinction. Some of the films which were talking about the emergency era, one was Nasbandi, which was made in 1978 by I.S. Johar. It was a spoof which was in which it remembered the emergency for the compulsory sterilization program which was launched by the government. As you can see on the screen, that how Nasbandi was talking about the sterilization program of the government. Then Kissa Kursi Ka was a political film which made the mockery of Sanjay Gandhi's automobile manufacturing plans. It was a satirical take on Indian politics during emergency. Then there were other films also during this time which were made, and even in the later times as well. Hazaron Khwaishein Aisi was another film which was talking about the issues of those times. And Indu Sarkar in 2017, made by Madhur Bhandarkar, it also talks about a 19-month long period of emergency from 1975 to 77, when there was a state of emergency. So we see that how the culture or cinema has also tried to talk about this period and communicate various facets which were attached to emergency. So thank you very much.